Professor Ned Cooke, who is the Charles F. Montgomery Professor of American Decorative Arts in the Department of History of Art at Yale University. He has written widely on early modern and modern material culture, with an emphasis on the relationship between production and consumption. His books include Making Furniture in Pre-Industrial America, The Social Economy of Newton and Woodbury, Connecticut, and Inventing Boston, Design, Production, and Consumption in the Atlantic World from 1680 to 1720. Professor Cooke has also written extensively on modern craft, historicizing and explicating more recent forms of production. This can be seen in his role as founding co-editor of the Journal of Modern Craft and guest editor of a special issue of American Art, focusing upon craft, as well as in his work as co-curator and publication author of 6 different exhibitions: New American Furniture at the MFA in '89, Inspiring Reform, Boston's Arts and Crafts Movement at the Davis Museum at Wellesley College in '97, Wood Turning in North America since 1930 at the Yale University Art Gallery in 2001, The Maker's Hand, American Studio Furniture 1940 to 1990 at the MFA Boston in 2003, and Inspired by China, Contemporary Furniture Makers Explore Chinese Traditions at the Peabody Essex Museum in 2006. And then more recently, Paul Evans, Crossing Boundaries and Crafting Modernism at the Michener Art Museum in 2014. We are here today to celebrate with Professor Cooke his new book that's just been published called Global Objects Toward a Connected Art History, published by Princeton University Press in 2022. So just immediately published. You all are among the first audiences to hear a presentation from Professor Cooke about the new book. His work is expanding the field of decorative arts and material culture and has led to several awards, including the Iris Foundation Award for Outstanding Contribution to the Decorative Arts in 2010, the Furniture Society's Award of Distinction in 2016, and his election as an honorary fellow of the American Craft Council in 2016, and College Art Association's Distinguished Teacher of Art History Award in 2018. The Distinguished Teacher Awards are probably our favorite because we value the teaching that you bring to us, Professor Cooke. So thank you so much for joining us today. I'm going to be the shameless self-promoter and tell everyone, all 400 of us here on this Zoom, to please purchase a copy of Professor's book, because these professors who join us for our Alumni Academy lectures, they do so out of their kindness and generosity to the Yale community. And it's important that we support them, that we support their work, that we tell Yale that their scholarship is valued, and that we encourage them to continue engaging with us here in the community. So I do invite you to consider purchasing a copy of Global Objects. We have it available through the Yale University bookstore, and there are signed copies. I understand, Professor Cooke, you did go and sign copies at the bookstore, right?
I did, yep.
There you go. So get them while they're hot and before they're all gone. I will put the link in the chat, and with that, I will pass to you to get our presentation started. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Lauren, for the generous introduction, and also for developing this program during a time of isolation and COVID. I think it's so important for communication, to be able to sort of reach out, and certainly we've learned how to Zoom and share screen, and that's actually been one of the positives, as long as it's not the only means of communication and connecting with people. But this is a great service that the Yale Alumni Academy really offers. And before I begin, I wanted to wish Annie Spokes Frost a happy birthday. I got that she was our daughter's classmate in Davenport in 2010. And she was excited, thinking that the Academy, the Yale Alumni Academy had sent her a birthday present this morning, which was the announcement about today's talk. Now, the field that I am involved with is oftentimes called decorative arts, applied arts, material culture, craft, any number of things. But one of the things that you should keep in mind is that it's always been considered a minor art. Those of you who can predate 2005 would know that there was a slide library over in Street Hall that was the bailiwick of Vince Scully, amongst others. And it was set up and my slides were in a little corner, literally called the minor arts. And all the big guns of painting, architecture, and sculpture, where Vince held court, were in the middle, given sort of primary kind of attention. And one could also sort of think of this visually in the way in which we might look at a portrait, conversation piece portrait by Arthur Davis, the British painter, and the way we tend to celebrate the two-dimensional object. And oftentimes the image takes priority size-wise, et cetera, over smaller things like a teapot produced by Wedgwood. And oftentimes these objects, these so-called minor arts, are really oftentimes in service to the meanings of the portraits. But what I'd like to do is flip the script a little bit and say, let's look at the objects themselves as a primary piece of evidence, and not think of them in service to the painting, but maybe how the painting, which is really restricted to a smaller audience, might actually be limited in comparison to an object like the Wedgwood teapot, which, after all, has all these other stories to it, not simply in the background presenting Mr. and Mrs. Hill as outstanding upper middle class landed gentry, but actually as consumers within the broader world of a teapot that is based on Chinese porcelain forms, that is serving a imported beverage that is tea, mixed with another sort of material from the Caribbean that is sugar, to then sort of use in a way that is tying people together. But the story is even more complex than that, in that Wedgwood took an imported form, an imported kind of use, imported material within it, but then had his own spin. He brought his own local knowledge about local clays, about the use of coal in the Staffordshire area and in the north of England to fire the kilns to better temperatures, of using the technology of copper plate engraving to have these transfer printed decorations on the body of the teapot, and then to import kaolin clay from the Cherokee country in America. So this is a object that has connections throughout the world. And what it's done is that it is brought together in England to create a movable product that actually circulates and informs and becomes more prescriptive, even if in terms of the image of the couple engaging in polite tea conversation in a garden with a enslaved servant off to the side, that really sort of speaks to aspirations, that has this much wider reach. And so it's this kind of act that this kind of flipping the script in some respects that I have been most interested in doing over time. About 9 years ago, I proposed a new course for Yale undergraduates, a new introduction to the history of art that was intended to provide an alternative to both the chronological progressive, one thing begot the other, sort of an Alfred Barr MoMA kind of sequence, or that would avoid national narratives. I still wanted to preserve this idea that an introductory art history course should engage students with firsthand evidence, real works of art, in a sustained, rigorous way. But I was trying to think about ways in which I could get the visual as well as the embodied analysis, that is, handling objects, using touch, using smell, using weight, all these other different ways of understanding a work of art. And really what was behind this impetus, and also objects from throughout the world, which oftentimes did travel throughout the world. And I thought what I really wanted to get at was what I call material literacy, rather than what I described as a taxonomical appreciation of being able to put an object into a little stylistic pigeonhole. So to me, it's not this object-centered study in which you look at a series of diagnostic features that led to a singular identification, attribution of an object frozen in time to put it in that pigeonhole, but rather I was interested in developing this idea of object-driven inquiry, in which a series of properties of diagnostic features could lead to an understanding of choice from among many possibilities, an acceptance of change over time, in essence, to work from the inside out rather than the outside in. And to me, what was key to this is thinking about objects, the life of the object, not just at a single point in time, but actually thinking about its life as it moved through time and space. And what this would do was be to allow objects to emerge as evidence, a way to offset the bias of written imperial records, of getting a sense of everyday life in terms of studying the past, but it would also lead to contemporary students' interest in looking at the material world around us and gaining greater curiosity, gaining tolerance of other people's material culture. So I've been teaching this for 9 years, working with the art gallery's collection and benefiting from lots of different feedback from undergraduates, from the graduates who have been teaching fellows for me, and then came out with this book that is just came out earlier this month. And you'll see right from the table of contents that this is not, I mean, when I describe that I'm teaching this course, many people always ask, where do you begin? Meaning they're thinking chronologically, or how do you account for the wide geography? And what I try to say is that it's not an encyclopedic, it's a suggestive way of thinking about objects broadly considered. And so where do you begin? You begin with the actual stuff out of which things are made, the raw materials, and in some respects start with a geography, a topography of materials, and then work through what a craftsman would do with them, to then its emergence from the shop, and therefore you get into movement and its use in society, and then ultimately thinking about it over time, thinking about meaning. So if you think about these three different categories of making, movement, and meaning, what you do is you move from the concrete to the abstract. And it's a way in which you build off of that foundation of the actual materiality. So let me just walk you through a couple of examples that might clue you in terms of how this approach can open up so many different things. So making and materials. So thinking about lacquer, which people have always associated with East Asia, the Yurishi tree lacquer, which is basically a protoplastic. It is a way of encasing wood so that it will not be affected, moisture will not penetrate it, but it also allows you to do some decoration. And the ways in which most people have thought about it is classic, cinnabar red lacquer, black lacquer in China. And certainly some of the work that's coming out of the Nagasaki and Kyoto area of Japan in the 16th and 17th century for export, in this case, oftentimes referred to as non-bond lacquerware. You see an example on the left. And oftentimes people will just think about lacquer and thinking, okay, it's associated with East Asia. And this is a good example of it. But they'll oftentimes think of the lacquers being sort of subservient to the European market, or thinking about the Jesuits who are coming to the southern island of Kyushu in the 16th century, sort of creating this kind of work that they don't know exactly what they're doing other than satisfying that kind of foreign market, non-bond being the Japanese term for southern barbarians. But What's striking is that the Japanese lacquerers had an incredible sense of what the Portuguese aesthetic values were, that they had seen objects that were being produced in Goa that were brought to Japan as part of that longer Portuguese kind of religious mercantile empire, and realized that the Portuguese really liked the dense, richly sort of gold, silver kind of surface, because oftentimes a lot of the local Japanese lacquer work would be predominantly black with the natural scenery sort of given highlights rather than this kind of dense pattern that you see in the coffer on the left. The other thing that makes this a particularly interesting piece is that it was done and shipped at one point to South America across the Spanish galleon trade. And again, sort of all these interconnected networks where the silver coming from Potosi in present-day Bolivia, or from some of the mines in present-day Mexico, were fashioned into these corner pieces, the lock, escutcheon, replacing copper, which was originally put on it in Japan. So this is an object that is incredibly complex in terms of a Japanese material and technology done for consciously with agency for a European market, but then shipped and added on to while it's in transit back to Europe. And so it's easy to then think, oh, here's a piece that's coming from Colombia that you have on the right, that's also lacquer. And people have oftentimes just thought, oh, the people in Peru, in Colombia, in the Viceroyalty of Peru, are simply copying the kinds of work that's coming across the Pacific. But it's a very different tradition. It's an indigenous lacquer tradition that's referred to in the indigenous language as mopa mopa, which was a secretion of a plant right near where the leaves come into the branches that would be actually chewed, masticated to soften it, and then stretched out. And it becomes a material almost like saran wrap that then gets burnished onto a piece of wood. There are ways in which you can add colorants as you're chewing to create different kinds of colors, which are then these sheets are cut out before being burnished onto the cabinet. So in some respects, it's like a natural plant material marquetry in wood. And they are oftentimes the mopa mopa artisans, which had produced work on gourds locally on the eastern side of the Andes in Colombia, but shipped over to some of the Spanish officials in Peru, that they adapted to this new clientele, again, sort of indigenous control for an external kind of audience, and producing work that oftentimes crosses over between a local language as well as what the Spanish officials were really looking for. So these objects become so much more complex, and even sort of thinking about the difference of calling it mopa mopa, which is an indigenous term, to barniz de pasto, which is a Spanish attribution of thinking of it as varnish from Pasto, that area of Colombia in the eastern side of the Andes. So these are complex stories that materials really drive the complexity of these particular examples. One could also think about misunderstanding of different materials. One of the classic Congo materials was raffia palms, and being able to sort of split the fronds into a very fine fiber, which was woven not only into plain cloth, but actually with supplemental wefts, these kinds of ways in which textiles like linen or wool were being produced in Europe at this point. And the kinds of celebratory textiles that were really developed at this point were traded amongst the different regions in the Congo as political ambassadorial gifts. And so when the Portuguese came to West Africa, picked up some of these as sort of a sense of ambassadorial gift. They would oftentimes take them back to Portugal or to the papal collection in Rome, but they oftentimes then got lost. They looked a lot like some of the cloth that was cut velvet or other kinds of supplemental weft materials like with velvet, or even the sheen of linen, which is a kind of a shiny sheen to it. And it was misunderstood. It was thought of as the finest cloth equal to anything being produced in Europe, but how within 100 years, it's inventoried as being Portuguese, and then it's from Southeast Asia. So it's never really identified with West Africa until only recently again. So there's that great gap of a misunderstanding of materials and the possibilities of materials. And then one final sort of set is to thinking about, on the left, the use of ebony, a very dense, heavy tropical wood that is being harvested in the Tamil Nadu and the Sri Lankan area of South Asia, in which when some of the European trading companies were establishing their fortified ports along the east coast of South Asia, in Pulicat, which is what the Dutch settlement was, they had Dutch master craftspeople who would oversee local Tamil Nadu kinds of craftspeople working with local materials. And what you've got here is a cabinet which doors open up with drawers behind it. It's very much of a Dutch form in terms of its stretcher, its turnings, but and even the moldings are following a lot of sort of Dutch wavy moldings of furniture of that period. But it's done in solid kind of ebony at a point when most Dutch furniture was being veneered. And if it was using ebony, it was using ebony in very small areas. And even the carving here, based very much on the kind of Islamic carving that you'll see in different jolly screens, different kinds of ways in which stone and wood are carved in that late 17th century. So this becomes, again, one of these pieces that is grafted. It's eclectic in terms of combining local materials, local knowledge, local carving traditions, but in a form that is appropriate to a Dutch clientele, probably somebody who's Dutch who's living in that area. The other example that I've got here, a candlestick, the whole development of copper alloy was extremely sophisticated in the Islamic world. The craftsmen in Herat in the 12th and 13th century were amongst the most amazing metal workers in terms of their ability to manipulate the material, to cast it, to chase it, to inlay it with gold, silver, and yellow, sort of a more of a mastic kind of surface. And here you see sort of as those craftsmen migrated, were forced from Afghanistan and parts of Greater Persia due to the Mongol invasion, they come to the west, to Syria, to Egypt, and start to produce work there on the eastern edge of the Mediterranean for a European market, in this case, for a Venetian merchant family. So they've taken their ideas of sort of a mosque candlestick with the kinds of decoration and chasing and inlay that's appropriate, but then put a coat of arms for a Venetian family square in the middle. So they're catering to that new audience. This gives you a sense of the possibilities of materials and realization, sort of understanding the fact that makers oftentimes aren't simply passively responding to the market, but they're actively engaging, they're drawing, they're putting things together, that hybridity or eclecticism is not a bad thing, but it's a language of the marketplace. So then we might think about movement, trade, thinking about function, etc. And just looking at a sequence of 3 images here of textiles that sort of really talk about the transmission, the movement of images, oftentimes through actual works of art. So the panel on the left, it's a silk ground with silk embroidery, made in China, embroidered in China. There's one of these, it's in a temple in Kyoto. So they were made as an export item. And what is really sort of distinctive about them is a central peony with a pair of phoenixes around it, sort of the ways in which you have a geometric border arranged around it with different kinds of mythical creatures. And to know, again, sort of like you go from that embroidered piece to then slightly later, a piece from Peru that at first glance just looks like it's a little bit brighter in color, but it's actually a whole different kind of technology. It's a woven hanging. It's not simply embroidered. And so with tapestry weaving, with not silk, but with camelid wool, with cotton, and then a little bit of silk thread that was oftentimes simply not produced locally, but actually was imported, oftentimes unraveled from imported textiles. So the camelid wool comes from the mountainous part of the Andes, and the cotton from the dry coast of Peru and Ecuador. So these weavers take the same format, the peony, the phoenix, the animals, they update some of the animals, they add European animals, they have local animals like alpacas and vicunas, and they also accentuate red in terms of the background of the weaving. And the red is based on cochineal, which is basically an insect that is feeding off of cacti up in New Spain and what is now Mexico. So cochineal becomes this symbol of power, of authority, of redness, so that you can read this as a locally made product that speaks to a local clientele, but is in conversation with a piece of Chinese embroidery. And then to go forward into the 18th century and realize that in Portugal, where these connections are through the Pacific trade, the Spanish galleons going to the Manila, and then oftentimes Manila is the center of some regional trade that goes to Macau, a Portuguese colony in China. And you start to see this kind of connection of that same sort of Chinese embroidery affecting Portuguese embroidery. And in this case, instead of having a silk ground, it's a linen ground. So it's a local European material that has silk embroidery on top, but the same kind of imagery is carrying through all 3 different locations. And it's not copying so much as looking at it and responding to it on the needleworkers or the weavers' own terms. We might think about the ways in which pieces of objects circulate. So Chinese porcelain, blue and white porcelain, that was so popular with the Portuguese initially in the 16th century, and then the Dutch in the 17th century, and how a decorative painter by the name of William Cooke starts to incorporate pieces of plates, the center medallions of plates, but set into his turned wooden plates, in which he then uses a technique of with varnish and bronze powders, gold leaf, to create the effect of Japanning, of the lacquer work coming from Japan. And they start to use the term in the Netherlands and in England, they refer to it as Japanning, which they say is basically that sort of essentializing of East Asia. It's Japan, it's China, it's even India. But the idea that it is an orientalizing kind of technique of black and gold. And you can see the way in which Cooke even does it on a sheet metal plate on the left, which mimics a lot of the kinds of Chinese porcelain, blue and white, a type that's referred to as crockware, in which you have these panels along the rim, and then you have an animal likely in the middle of the plate. And croc comes from the Portuguese word for the ship that would be carrying goods back and forth, carac, that gets shortened as a shorthand for this kind of exported porcelain from China in the late 16th and early 17th century. So this sort of object, the plates, particularly on the right side, really address this notion about you import ideas of Japanning, you import actual products, and you meld it together to produce something for a European market. But you may not have Europe associated in some of these connections. In Gujarat, up in northwestern India, the whole trade of mother and pearl and shingling that you see in the coffer on the left, in which you're taking small mother of pearl shingles and nailing them onto a wooden coffer, oftentimes used for jewelry, precious items. They become used for reliquary chests. You'll see coffers like this actually find an incredible market in the Arab world, where Gujarat is trading block printed cottons and this mother of pearl work to the Arab world, and then sometimes from them into the Mediterranean world. But yet, at the same time, the work not only goes west, but it goes east. As I said, some of the Portuguese end up sort of carrying things with them from Goa to Japan. And you see a coffer on the right that is very much influenced by this idea of mother of pearl shingles. But instead of nailing slightly larger ones on, these are set into the lacquer and produce this kind of flat surface of small shingles. And actually, the mother of pearl is cut quite thin as opposed to the thicker kind of shingles on the Gujarati piece. But yet on the inside of the lid is more traditional, local, what I talked about with the black and gold, with a lot more black than for the Portuguese market. That's what's on the inside of the lid of the coffer. So this is a dynamic that's between Japan and Gujarat in present-day India that really speaks to the ways in which materials, ideas, people even might have moved back and forth. And just to think about sort of the hold of movement and what I sometimes refer to as almost a luxurious function. You know, we tend to want to think of these objects as single use, as a reliquary casket, to think of a plate as something that you're going to dine with. But oftentimes, some of these objects that travel far, that are hard won, because remember, this is a point when it takes 2 years to sail from Lisbon to Nagasaki in Japan because of the different kinds of wind direction, monsoon season, et cetera. And to see the ceiling of a room at the Santos Palace, this is looking straight up into a pyramidal ceiling with 200 and some odd plates that are providing the decoration for the inside of that particular pyramid. This really sort of speaks to the ways in which we have to think about these objects really as portable works of art that are being displayed in this fashion, that don't have any particular use as tableware, the way we might want to think of it now, but as decorative devices that really speak to your connections. And I think that kind of notion about blue and white is another one of these issues that really needs to be addressed through this kind of global lens, because now with most people, when you say blue and white ceramics, you automatically think Chinese porcelain. But the history is quite a bit deeper than that, in that the opposite empire in the Arab Peninsula was developing a different blue and white that was based on a tin oxide over an earthenware body, but using cobalt from a certain part of what is now Iran to decorate, to set up this blue and white contrast. And how some of these dishes, which have been found in underwater archaeological sites in Southeast Asia, part of this trade of aromatics, incenses, et cetera, coming from the Arab world to China, and then bringing ceramics, earthenware, and stoneware primarily back to the Arab Peninsula. There was extensive trade in the 8th and 9th century. And what you see here on the right is a stoneware manufacturer in China in the 9th century who are looking at the work coming from the Arab Peninsula and then producing it with imported cobalt to produce work that would satisfy this blue and white kind of decoration. So they're doing it in their stoneware tradition as opposed to a tin glazed earthenware tradition. They're both using imported cobalt. And this idea of blue and white therefore has this whole kind of East Asian Arab Peninsula kind of connection right from the get-go. And you start to see the development, in the Islamic world from tin glazed earthenware to what is called fritware, which is ultimately a body of ground quartz and some white clay, producing a very fine white surface of a body that then has the local cobalt decoration on it, such as you see on the left from Kashan. And yet the porcelain developments in Qingdechen in China, which start in the 13th century, they learn how to develop this nice white glaze on a white body, but they're importing their initial cobalt from Iran. And actually they refer to it at that time as Muslim blue. So there are these connections that you can see not only in terms of materials, but even the ways in which this box with kind of generic Arabic writing on it is intended for that market from which the cobalt comes. And this whole conversation between blue and white fritware from the parts of the Islamic world and blue and white porcelain from the Chinese world continue through 2 centuries. These are the 2 great ceramic centers producing blue and white wares. And you start to see sort of a Qingdechen plate on the left with a bunch of grapes decoration, the ways in which a probably Iznik pottery is producing the blue and white piece on the right that speaks to this kind of conversation. And in fact, all the great collections of porcelain and the collections of fritware are sort of intermingled. So the Artable shrine in Isfahan has both. Topkapi Palace in Istanbul has both, and has this kind of ways in which the world of blue and white is very much conversation between these 2 different empires. And even sort of that crockware that I was talking about before, where the paneled kinds of rims of plates that William Kick was working with, you can see the ways in which you have a Chinese porcelain plate. Then the Portuguese, who are the first people who are really trading in Chinese porcelain, develop their tin glazed earthenware with a lighter blue, very finely potted. And the Dutch come on and take over some of the Portuguese trade routes and start to produce a thicker kind of blue and white initially that's a tin glazed earthenware. So again, this is the way in which blue and white starts to spawn all these other kinds of local variations thereof. But I find it gets so complex by the time you get into the 18th, early 19th century, where then the 2 real centers are not so much Iznik and the fritware tradition, but it's thinking about Staffordshire and what Josiah Wedgwood and others have done to make Stoke-on-Trent and Staffordshire the real sort of center of the ceramic world in the second half of the 18th century, and how these objects that you see here are so interconnected that you have a plate on the left in which it's basically sort of working off of Chinese motifs, blue and white on refined earthenware with a white glaze, but it's transfer decoration. This is all sort of, you engrave a copper plate, you ink up a tissue, put ink on the plate, put tissue, and then put the tissue on the plate. So you produce the same design time after time after time, but it's meant to look like a Chinese plate, which is hand painted. Then you do have a hand painted plate here in the middle that you can see is working off of the same scene, but it's not transfer printed. It's the Chinese Qingdechen response to the British example, which is responding to a Chinese hand-painted example. So is it Chinese? Is it British? Hard to know. Or even sort of thinking about a plate on the right, also from Qingdechen, that in the so-called Fitzhugh pattern, where you've got these 4 clusters around a central medallion. That's very much of a transfer decorated way of conceiving the composition of the decoration of a plate. The rim around it is also a conventionalized way of thinking about a transfer decorated rim, but all of the Qingdechen Fitzhugh pattern is hand painted. So again, it's sort of the Chinese are riffing off of the British kind of borrowing of their tradition to try to get their way into that particular market. Then I might just finish up talking about meaning instead of thinking about objects as they flow over time. And one can think about issues like gift. Yes, sometimes you have a gift, you have an ambassadorial gift, but there's also an extreme of gift. I looked at the raffia weaving earlier as sort of a form of ambassadorial gift, but there's also plunder. So these are 2 of the great examples of this idea of gift as a form of plunder as a form of gift. That the covered bronze pitcher that you have on the left was produced in England in the 14th century. It's got royal coats of arms that are cast into it. But its history after the late 14th, early 15th century is obscured. No one knows what happened to it. It appears only in the late 19th century in West Africa, amongst the Ashante. And as part of the whole conquest, the ways in which the British overran Benin and the palaces there, this was actually there, not just the Benin, this is in essence part of a Benin bronze, but instead of being one of those masks or figural, it was being used as a charm to be carried into battle for protection. It was oftentimes found in similar ones also found in burial sites. So it is a form of a talisman. But curiously enough, it gets seized as plunder by some of the British officers. It's brought back to Britain. It's encased in a plexi case at the British Museum as the Ashante Jug, which I found so fascinating that they don't embrace its prior 14th century Britishness, Englishness, but actually they're thinking of it as a part of an imperial project in the British Museum, sort of rebranding it, if you will. It's the same way in which the tent, sort of the panels of painted cottons that you see on the right side, which are up at now at Powys Castle in Wales, they were typical product of the Coromandel Coast, painted and block printed cottons. People oftentimes had portable tents, even the rulers like Tipu Sultan, who was a real thorn in the British military adventures in South India, that he would defeat them in battle. And when they finally were able to beat his army, they literally were excited to finally kill the Tiger of Mysore and plundered his palace and took everything they could. This was acquired by one of the generals who was in charge of the conquest of Tipu Sultan's palace, who then gave it to the governor of Madras, Edward Clive, as a form of thank you for support. And so now it's back in the UK, sort of asserting Clive's own status as an aristocrat, not simply a member of the East India Company, a person who was sort of taking advantage of extracting wealth and influence from South Asia. We might think about personal gifts, the ways in which, the potlatch ceremony in the northwest coast of the US and Canada, how coppers, which were sort of oftentimes heraldic devices, but were given as a form of respect, that were given out in a culture that was not as materially based, but was more about respect of cultures, of family alliances, so that something like a copper took on this kind of deep value that went beyond the idea of function, but what it was sort of a social integration. In the same way that you might think about a snuff box, a tobacco box, holding something was appropriate to certain status, people of certain status in the 18th century, that you would take a pinch of snuff as a form of stimulant, medicine, whatever. But it was more than just, you may not have just one snuff box. For instance, Elihu Yale, when he died, had 300 snuff boxes in his possession. And one starts to get a sense that oftentimes this is a material equivalent of a calling card, that you could give a snuff box to a friend. And here you've got the engraving on it, from Ralph Meadow to Samuel Waterworth. And it's well worn, so that this is an object that obviously has been handled, that is part of the life of the object, continues on as a reminder of one's friendship, somebody that you knew back in 1716. To go from gift to thinking about surface. And oftentimes we, I think, again, sort of oftentimes don't contextualize the importance of surface. In the late 17th century, there's this whole immersion in veneers, of sawing thin pieces of figured wood, burls and things like that, that you see in the high chest on the left. And oftentimes, people now tend to think about veneer as being cheap, that it's ersatz, you can't afford something with solid wood. But this is actually being produced at a time in a place where there's plenty of solid wood. Why would you go with veneer? And I think that there's a way in which, if you connect this to natural history at this time, this is a point at which the microscope comes into active pursuit by gentlemen scientists, of looking at close-ups of sections of materials like palm trees. And if you start to think of these drawers as sections that are framed by this herringbone kind of banding around the edge, and think of it almost like an illustration from Robert Hooke's books on sort of the natural world, that instead of having a line engraving with a black line around it, you've got this burl veneer surrounded by a very geometric kind of border, that one can read this piece from the front as a form of natural history illustration, not as a case of can't afford solid wood at this point. In the same way, we could think about silver plate as being cheap product today. And if we look at Sheffield silver, when it was first developed in the late 18th century, what it is ultimately, this is the ultimate confluence of art and science, of taking metal and fusing it onto a copper substrate at the exact time when there was an interest in the tautness of neoclassicism, that you can develop these shapes to present sort of something that is new, that's new fashion, not simply in terms of its decoration, but in terms of its very materiality. So again, not thinking about veneers or plating as something that is has negative associations, but trying to understand it in the period at which it was produced. And then finally, I end up with the importance of touch. And objects are really important for the way one approaches objects is not simply visual. I talked about sort of the embodied experience. And I was really taken by an article that Adam Gopnik did a number of years ago, in which he said, that every sense has an art form. He said the ear has music, the eye has painting, the taste has gastronomy. And he said touch is the sense that has no art form to it. And my whole book sort of culminates in this idea that touch is essential to understanding objects. Touch is the way we really understand it. That's where we had the most number of nerve endings in our body, and how Chinese connoisseurs from the 17th century and even from the 13th century talk so much about touch, feel, texture of surfaces, weight, all these different things, and how with the age of tourism and orientalizing tourism in the Levant that you see in the 19th century, when languages were starting to come into conflict with one another, what language is in common is the language of touch. So I hope what I've done is at least sort of conveyed a sense of the variety of objects, the way in which one can start from the inside with materials, with the idea of realization, which is more than just sort of craftsmanship, but it has to do with mental templates. It has to do with influence of outside objects, to move through the circulation of objects as they get shipped, used, adjusted in some ways, and then to start thinking about meaning. That is, these objects have meaning more than just sort of putting them into stylistic categories or dating them, but they actually have many stories to tell, and stories that oftentimes connect. And to leave you with one image, if you think about these objects that are really truly floating on ships, passing from east to west, west to east, north to south, that's the complex world. And so as I'm teaching this material, students who are traveling much more than we had ever done, at least I'm speaking for my generation, that they understand this idea of fluidity. They understand that we live in a sort of decentered world in some respects. And so this idea of objects sort of almost anticipating our own movements really resonates well with them. Thanks very much.
Thank you. That was a wonderful presentation, and I appreciated so many of the comments in the chat of people who either were your students while they were at Yale and were really excited to be back in the virtual classroom with you, Professor Cooke, or people who did not get to take your course or take enough art history courses while they were at Yale and felt like this was an opportunity to kind of soak up some of the magic that they missed. So thank you so much for that presentation. And I'm delighted that you're going to remain on the line with us for another half hour or so to do Q&A. So I want to invite everyone to, if you have a question, please do post it in the Q&A box. Don't use the chat if possible. Please do use the Q&A, because that's really helpful to us in keeping track of the questions that are asked. I also want to just extend a couple of welcomes to people that I saw giving introductions in the chat. First of all, there were many, many parents of Yale students who introduced themselves. And we at Alumni Academy are definitely an inclusive community, so we always love to welcome parents. You perhaps can get jealous when your kids are at Yale and you're not. So this is a way for you to partake. You're definitely a part of our community. And I also wanted to welcome there were a number of people who are docents at different museums. So that was great to see as well. So just wanted to say welcome to all of you who are docents at the different museums around the country, and thank you for introducing yourselves. And I want to invite everyone to purchase a signed copy of the book. So I am going to place in the, there we go, we placed in the chat a link to how you can how you can purchase the book through the Yale bookstore. So thank you all for supporting Professor Cooke and supporting his book, and supporting our work at Alumni Academy to amplify the work of faculty at Yale. So I want to start with Susan's comment. Susan said that Susan is a quilter and felt very connected to the idea of touch, and talk about how quilting is an art of touch. So I wonder if you could comment on that, because I know you didn't get to present as much on quilting, but it certainly is one of the core, part of the core, I think, of the American craft lexicon. So I'm really curious what you would say about quilting.
Yeah, I think, quilting is I do have a number of places which I talk about quilting, because it's a great subject that has associations of using new fabric, and oftentimes when textiles were so expensive up until the mid-19th century, that one tried to use them quite judiciously and conservatively. So there's a way in which the manipulation of the materials in sewing, whether it's doing something that is piecework, in which you're actually literally sort of folding edges and then trying to stitch a very tight edge there, or applique, where you're doing something on top of another textile. But it's also got this association with using scraps. So on the one hand, you have sort of this idea of using fresh, new, like some of the printed cottons, the so-called chintzes in the late 18th, early 19th century. But you also had this idea of scraps, of making something, probably best known in terms of the Gee's Bend material from Alabama in the 20th century, in which you use anything you can as a way of making a blanket.
That's exactly what I was thinking of. Yeah.
And then later on, it gets used for something else, as in hung in an art museum, taken in a very different context. It goes sort of from horizontal to vertical, which I find really fascinating. But there's also a part of me that is really quite intrigued with the idea of how one approaches, when you look at a quilt, it's not simply visual. How many times do you go in and see quilts that they're hung up on a wall of a museum that you just want to go touch? You want to feel the weight of them on you. Is it a heavy quilt? Is it not? What are the seams like of the flat woven piecework? And then on top of that is this whole idea of the meaning of them in terms of gift. Oftentimes, there are lots of them that are done as gifts to a daughter, a gift on somebody's wedding, of putting these pieces together, people involved in a communal effort to make something that would be both a functional object, but also something more, sort of functional plus in some respects. And so there are quilts, like in the art gallery, there's a wonderful, what's known as a crazy quilt from the 1880s, in which they've got all these patches and embroidery of different parts of imagery, that they're having gold threaded cross stitching between a lot of the different pieces. But it was given as a wedding present. And you oftentimes wonder, so how did it come into the museum? How did it not stay in the family? Did someone not appreciate this as something that had emotional value as a gift? So I don't know, it's just, so touch comes into it in so many different ways of how one engages, produces it, engages with it, thinks about it over time.
I really
enough quilting.
Yeah, well, that'll have to be another lecture. But I was going to just reply that I really was intrigued by your commentary on the Gee's Bend quilt, because it also made me think about this approach that you consider the materials as well. And when I saw the Gee's Bend exhibit, I noticed that looking at the materials told me a lot about the lives of the quilters.
Yeah.
themselves.
Like
So
the old worn denim and things like that. And then you start looking at even the threads for putting some of the pieces together, and how different they are once the contemporary Geesben quilters are doing the work now. It's night and day.
right, absolutely. So it adds another dimension. You know, I really appreciate the pillars that you've kind of given us to use to think about objects. And I want to use that to go to, I hope I'm saying your name correctly, Jaime's question, which is, how would you consider this approach? You know, these kind of pillars that you've given us, how would you consider it when looking at funerary objects?
Yeah, I mean, I think one can, and I have actually taught a course on the material culture of death, you know, sort of more from an American perspective. But you could really think anything from gravestones to funerary rings to mourning traditions of clothing, etc. There are certain haberdashers that sort of cater directly, at least in the 19th century when the industry was so big, catered directly to that particular market. So I think you could really sort of do a parallel. I mean, I was looking mainly at what I would consider domestic functional objects today in the book, but I think you could do a whole study of funerary objects, and everything from clothing to hardware for coffins, for instance, to urns for ashes, and the ways in which people are engaging with these very meaningful sorts of objects and trying to get the right material, having the right person produce it, etc. I mean, just gravestones are a classic example of that, sort of the ways in which there are certain custom stones, but then there are also the kind of standard ones too. And what's the message that's trying to be conveyed within that?
I'm thinking about the practice of making jewelry and memorable items. I don't know what you would call them, out of people's hair, locks of hair. Yeah.
Yeah, the hair jewelry, you know, there's a lot of work that has come up, not just for as funerary jewelry, oftentimes lockets that you wear close to your heart, obviously, and brooches, but also it gets used as a kind of a extension of affection, in the same way that we might think about charm bracelets and things like that in the 1960s, is this idea of you use your hair to make something to give a token of affection, in the same way that that snuff box made that same sort of connection in the early 18th century.
So we've talked with that subject, you know, talking about sort of repurposing hair as a funerary object and repurposing clothing in the Geesben quilts, about this idea of sort of repurposing objects and creating new material culture out of it. I want to go to Virginia's question. She says, it's noticeable in the era of climate change that many sculptors are repurposing trash in their work. And can you comment on these kinds of self-reflective developments in the history of objects?
Yeah, there's a whole movement. I would actually put it back into the 1960s. There are a lot of craftspeople, and I'm thinking about Ed Rosbach, who's a weaver, who starts using trash bags, film, celluloid film, all sorts of things to start weaving into his baskets, because there's that whole interest in the 1960s across lots of different craft and art media, of this interest of the everyday material and how to make the everyday into something that's different. And it's not driven by an environmental movement at that point so much as sort of trying to overturn hierarchies, overturning the status of precious materials, and trying to sort of work with the everyday, what's available that you could work with. And I think that it has assumed new resonance today as we start thinking about piles of waste, because certainly that wasn't on people's minds in the 1960s, thinking about trash heaps at that point.
So you highlight, I think, interestingly in your response, sort of the mindset of of the maker and
Mhm.
how they re-envision pieces. And I want to think about Cheryl's question with regard to that. So Cheryl says traditional art examination focuses on the artist. How does your global approach consider the artisan makers?
I think what it, oftentimes when there's that whole interest in the individual artist, if you want to think about a fine arts approach, that people think about the studio, thinking about sort of that process of what I would call realization as sort of something that's nice and neat and tidy in some respects. And they think about sort of visual kinds of vocabularies. One of the things that I've been really interested by taking sort of I refer to it as almost as a shop floor perspective and thinking about the economics of making in some respects. How do you survive in a pre-industrial era in which you're not tooled up, but you have to sort of adapt quickly to changing markets? And the ways in which these makers oftentimes are building off of the way they are taught, which is, habit, the workmanship of habit is so much an important part of the way in which you learn a particular skill through repetition, whether it's Malcolm Gladwell's 10,000 hours, whatever, sort of like the idea that it gets inculcated in you, but that doesn't mean that you stay static for your entire life. What happens is you've got new people move in with different skills. You might have different clientele who ask you to do something different based on what they had seen. They might bring an object in, say, could you make me another one? But then you have to do it your way. Or you might actually get up and move and go somewhere else and then introduce your system in. And so it's this constant kind of, people always want to use the term tradition as sort of a static, stable kind of endeavor. But tradition is always dynamic. It's always moving. It's always changing and morphing. And by calling something traditional, all you're doing is sort of freezing the frame at one particular point in time. These are people who have to, as I said, they're making a living. They can't afford to sit there and think great thoughts in their shop at the bench. Everything's got to be efficient, economical, and it's got to be fitting into the rhythms of that particular context. So to me, much of the models that we've generated of a lot of artists is as if they're in control of their, look at how we even think about sort of, we use the term patronage in terms of talking about art. Is it fair to talk about patronage of a metalsmith, a cabinet maker, a weaver? I would say maybe in a royal context in certain places you might think about patronage, but for the most part, it's business.
I think that's a really interesting point, especially when you look at material work from antiquity versus now. And it brings me to someone who raised the question about Indigenous North American, Native American makers, and talking about from sort of pre-contact time, what kinds of pieces of their work would be found in your survey of global objects. And the question was also particularly, is there any evidence of an intercultural exchange in the way that you saw between the sort of the Chinese and the British in the China work? Do you see that in sort of the Native American, really talking about those groups in North America?
Yeah, I mean, there are a number of pieces that I have in terms of Haudenosaunee ceramics or northern kind of wood, sort of working with burl woods, as well as Southwest pottery. And so from the Pueblo area. And these are all, I mean, it's really important to think about the Indigenous world too, because they actually think of their materials not as a commodity to be extracted, but oftentimes as living entities, non-human beings in some respects.
And that's exactly why I sort of raised it when you talked about, material work as merchandise, and the
Yep.
need to create is there's a real contrast there with the Indigenous worldview on these pieces.
Yeah, and so it becomes one of these real issues of use and function, how they sort of function in one way as a spiritual manifestation of a living material, and then get commodified, as it were, from outsiders, and the use kind of transposed, and then ultimately then the life taken out of them if they're put on view underneath a vitrine. I mean, it's the same way of talking about the Ashante Jug in the British Museum, that, is it fair to sort of have these in rarefied areas when in fact it's like they're in prison because they are living entities themselves?
And it's a real controversial topic, I think, and particularly with the idea that you could separate the piece from its community.
Yeah.
The community that created it, or the community whose culture created it, and that it's living in a museum somewhere halfway along around the world is somehow taking something away, not just from the creator and the community that created it, but from the object itself.
Yeah, so I tried, to weave a lot of the Indigenous material into this too, just as different kinds of counterpoints, or at least to flesh out the complexities of this kind of material world.
Well, two people have raised a point around cultural appropriation, is the phrase that Jane used. And just talking about, Jane was intrigued by your description of multidirectional cross flow, sort of sharing and inspirational dynamics, but wants to talk and think about cultural appropriation as a counterpoint to that. And there was another question that came in privately that was speaking about returning objects to their countries of origin, and suggests that, I'm going to say it wrong, but the tent of Tipu Sultan,
Yep.
the tiger of Mysore, should be with the citizens of India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh, is the comment. And it just sort of gets at exactly what we were just talking about, is that the object belongs not just to its maker, but the community that gave rise to its themes. So I just wonder if you could speak to those comments, because they're questions that have come up from the group.
Yeah, and I spent some time trying to distinguish between appropriation, adaptation, mimicry, copying, because I think these are terms we sort of tend to throw around. If you take the point of view of, appropriation to me is taking somebody else's cultural patrimony and profiting from it yourself. It really comes down to a form of exploitation that I think, and the world is filled with this and always has been in some respects. But if you start to think about this idea of adaptation, in which somebody is, you're in a shop, you're seeing something, you say, oh, that looks like a really good idea, I'm going to incorporate that within this product, so that you're not necessarily putting somebody down and having that material benefit yourself, but actually it's part of a larger conversation. That's what sort of, isn't that what people are always doing, instead of working with visual stimuli and material stimuli and being able to recombine them in different ways? If it's sort of a kind of blending, a grafting that is equal-sided, that's one thing. But if it's being used as a system of economic exploitation, cultural exploitation, then I would have problems. So that whole notion about primitivism, for instance, of Picasso and others sort of looking at North African masks and benefiting from those collections and representing them, that gets, in the way primitivism is oftentimes construed, becomes a lot harder than if it was sort of a more balanced kind of adaptation of some of those things within a sort of more horizontal way rather than a vertical way. But I think we have to pay attention to, again, it's sort of like the specificity of place and social structure becomes really important to be clear about this.
Really well said, and thank you for that clarifying, because lots of people are intrigued by the question, and I think it's a really wonderful, clear sense of direction you've given us about how to think about those things. I want to switch to a topic that a lot of people are excited about, which is the emphasis you made on touch in the presentation. So one person has asked the question, they didn't identify themselves, but Adam Gopnik's idea about art of touch wants to know more about what is he referring to, because all art forms involve touch in terms of the process of creating them. So is he talking about how the viewer or the listener experiences it?
Yeah, I think that's, if you read his analogies of thinking about cooking and gastronomy with taste, his is all from the consumer's point of view. And so that's why he thinks that touch doesn't have an art form. And what I want to do is sort of shift it and think that touch is involved in every aspect of the kind of material I look at, from digging clay, from spinning fiber, to carving wood. I mean, your hands and your fingers are always involved with everything, and it's the biomechanical feedback from fingers and hands to your eyes and to your brain. It's a three-part circuit, and that's what is so critical. And because he's only thinking from a consumer, and also one could say even sort of a consumer of images more than anything else, sort of the way in which he's not interested in thinking about touch having an art form associated with it, I think really sort of it really speaks to how he's looking at the world.
I want to go to Claire's question from that, because I love how you describe this sort of biomechanical feedback loop. And I know you've curated a number of museum exhibits. And so Claire asked, is there a future of including touch in exhibitions so that we can restore some of the original context to the objects? Of course, that's really challenging to do when you're dealing with some piece of antiquity that is really valuable and perhaps very delicate. So I wonder how you've considered that as you've mounted exhibitions.
Yeah, the hard part is that the mission of a museum is collection, preservation, and display. And by having preservation in the middle there, that the oils in your fingers are detrimental to metal. They'll corrode metal. That handling a piece of wood, a piece of furniture, maybe you put it back wrong, or you put a drawer in wrong, and it can break something. That textiles can lose, you can become unraveled through time and can be worn, or insects could get it. I mean, there's so many things that one has to be constantly aware of maintenance. So there have been places where, like the British galleries at the V&A, where they put reproduction. They've worked closely with craftspeople to do reproductions to sort of satisfy your sense of touch. So you can sort of feel a little bit of that material. But I've actually found in my teaching, and this is where it's so good to be teaching at Yale, and for the course that I'm teaching, sections are in the art gallery, but we just don't we don't stand in front of art and talk about them. We actually meet in an object study classroom, and we pass things around. So the students are constantly touching things and assessing them, turning them over, looking on the inside. There are very few museums that will dedicate space for an object study classroom because they want to have everything on view. But the Yale Art Gallery, the British Art Center, and now the Peabody are all dedicated, and Beinecke all have object study classrooms where we can actually bring things from collections and be able to handle them, look at them, close study firsthand. But I've also, since COVID, I've also gotten interested in making exercises. I realized during COVID that students were spending too much time on screen. So I started developing making kits to work with clay, to do cardboard loom weaving, and then adding on metalwork to hammer copper discs into bowls as a way for them to understand something about material, about the body as a tool, to think about that sort of triangulation of eye, brain, and hand. And it's been phenomenal to sort of see the ways in which students carry sort of looking at finished objects and then also trying their hand. I'm not training makers, I'm training sensibilities. And to see the way in which they then respond to things, even if they're going through a museum and something's on view, they have points of access to make it come alive as if they were touching it.
It makes me think about the number of people who started learning to bake bread during the beginning of the pandemic. It's kind of the same. They didn't have the benefit of you as their professor to give them a maker's kit, but it's the same concept. And I'm really glad that you mentioned the classroom experience, because it gives me a chance to make a little commercial break for Alumni Academy. We offer on-campus courses in the summer. Last summer, our on-campus course was American Transcendentalism, Emerson and Thoreau. And we did take an afternoon to go to the Beinecke and examine materials related to both authors. And the Beinecke actually has a piece of the cabin that Thoreau built at Walden Pond with the nails sort of sticking out of it. And it's exactly what you said, sitting there examining that piece, it gives a completely different context when you're reading Thoreau's work. Than just the philosophical. So this three-dimensional experiencing of objects is another way of knowing, I think is one of the main points that I'm learning from your talk today.
And that's where I started. It was Charles Montgomery sort of passing objects around and handling them, that all of a sudden I was interested in history, but I didn't want to do political history, economic history, or anything like that. It was also like it was everyday history came alive.
Well, and I encourage people to consider that if you're coming to New Haven and you're coming to Yale, that the Beinecke, I know the Beinecke does make spaces available for people to come in and handle objects. You do have to make an appointment and make requests, but that is something accessible to the alumni community. So I know we're coming up on the last couple of minutes. There are tons of really great questions in the Q&A. But before I go to any others, I'd like to know, Professor Cooke, if there's anything you want to make sure that you say before we begin to wrap up our last couple of minutes.
I can't imagine being able to teach a course like this anywhere but Yale. Because there's this long tradition of the use of collections for the students. And I'm always reminded when I go elsewhere and people think it's really pathbreaking that you pass a tray around with objects, smaller objects in it, for students to think like they're seeing the real thing, as opposed to touching, as opposed to handling, and really, being able to trust an undergraduate to work responsibly with a work of art. I think it's really one of Yale's really important elements of their educational mission.
Yeah, that's a fantastic point. Well, and they trust the alumni community too, because you can come back and handle some of these pieces.
Yep.
I guess I'll just finish with one point that's come up a couple of times. And it's the question that I know anyone who writes a book hates to hear right at the moment that their book is being published. What is the next book?
I don't know. I'm in the midst of a couple of articles, so we'll see what happens. Because this and the Boston book came out really sort of right on the one on the heels of the other. So it's sort of time to breathe a bit. But I tend not to sort of, a lot of my research ends up being sort of part plan, part serendipity. So it's not as if there's something that is the next, but I think it is going to be something. I'm following my instincts and following the supply chain, the commodity chain in some respects. So I have a feeling, even though I'm trained as an Americanist, I'm still branching out from that. And so it's really finding out where things go from here, how things get here in some respects.
Well, for sure, there's never a shortage of objects to explore, and there are always new ones.
They're all around.
So I know that we will hear more from you. And in the meantime, I encourage everyone to check out the book, Global Objects Toward a Connected Art History. And we will post the link once more in the chat just now. Anthony, if you're able to get it in so that people can purchase a signed copy from the Yale bookstore, really encourage you to support the book and dig deeper into the subject by reading it. And of course, Professor Cooke, you're invited back to talk to our Alumni Academy community at any time. This has been a pleasure. The comments in the chat have been really lovely. People just so enthusiastic to spend an afternoon on this topic. So thank you, and I hope to see you again soon.
My pleasure.
Okay, bye everyone. Thank you.